Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic and a new one. Let's do it. In your opinion, what is the most disturbing archaeological discovery? Please remember to like, share, say hi, and subscribe. Archaeology student here. Here's one I learned in class. A Pueblo village went through a horrible drought and famine. A dwelling was found with the remains of a family that had died violently and had several cut marks all over their body. They also found a human coprolite, ancient poop. It is common practice to run chemical analysis of coprolites to figure out a person's last meal. It was human flesh. The DNA of the flesh particles matched the DNA of the family. Somebody murdered and ate the family, then pooped in the house. There's an ancestral Puebloan story passed down by the Navajo of the gambler who came up from the south and enslaved the APs, forcing them to build great cities where they did not want to live and perform rituals involving cannibalism. Archaeologists later discovered South American parrot feathers and human bones with stone scrapings, evidence of cannibalism, in Chaco Canyon, a civilization that showed signs of early abandonment due to its low amount of burials and trash pits. Vikings' burial sites are pretty disturbing. They were often buried with their wives, slaves, and horses. The way Otzi, the Iceman, died was pretty gruesome too. Also, all of the mass graves of the past plagues. I live in a city where a couple of years ago a mass grave of hundreds of 19th century cholera victims was discovered. We knew they were there somewhere. We'd been finding bones in the ground for years. The discovery was still a shock for people who basically live now on this graveyard. Göbekli Tepe. The sheer magnitude and age of the site are itself mind-boggling. A civilization without writing and apparently lacking proper settlements or agriculture continued to develop this temple complex for thousands of years since 10,000 BCE. Some monoliths might require up to hundreds of people to bring and direct them. How did they pass the meaning of this endless project through generations? And the disturbing part, this huge complex was deliberately buried and thus well preserved under hundreds of cubic tons of dirt around 8,000 BCE. Imagine deliberately burying the Louvre Museum or the Vatican. What sort of horrible apprehension or presentiment about the future made them to abandon and inter a work of many generations? This thought gave me goosebumps as I stand there looking at the part uncovered by archaeologists. They mean only 5% of the complex was uncovered yet. I highly recommend visiting the site and museums of Urfa. I consider myself pretty well read and a student of human nature and history. I never heard of this before, so as soon as I finish this, I'm gonna go read and absorb as much I can about this. Fascinating. Thank you. Infant sacrifices in ancient Carthage. This is sort of a debate because we don't have direct evidence of child sacrifice. There's no big bloody altar labeled "burn babies here." But what we do have is Roman accounts of child sacrifice in Carthage. On its own, this isn't super damning. The Romans accused everyone they didn't like of doing human sacrifices. The part that's disturbing is the remains of infant cremations mixed in with cremated animal remains. This may have just been a Carthaginian burial tradition, an animal sacrifice accompanying a lost child. However, the odd thing is that the infant animal cremation are found separate from other burials, which suggests that the infant cremations were somehow different. If I had ever pursued anthropology beyond the undergraduate level, I had intended to focus on cannibalism for my master's degree and human sacrifice for my PhD. The behaviors appear aberrant to the casual observer, but when you look at it in terms of survival, among other reasons, it's actually a pretty logical decision to make. In terms of cannibalism, I think the most disturbing find is not a find at all at this point. I've been reading up on survival cannibalism in China during the Cultural Revolution, and as archives are opening up for study, Chinese historians have been able to gauge how common cannibalism was during that period. What's shocking is how common it was. Cannibalism also occurred during the 1990s famine in North Korea, and that doesn't surprise me at all, but the breadth of cannibalism and the number of recorded cases in China is far higher than I was expecting. I really just didn't think the records would be there to demonstrate it, but they are. So it's not necessarily an archaeological discovery that has happened, it's the one that's going to happen when future archaeologists open up Chinese grave sites from that period. probably the graves at the Catholic Bon Seours Mother and Baby Home in Tuam, Ireland, where in 2017 the bodies of over 800 children were dug up on the former home's ground. The average age of the victims was between 35 weeks and 3 years old, and in its day the care home served as a place of residence for orphans and abandoned children, and as a location where unwed mothers, typically teenagers, gave birth. The overwhelming majority of the children had died from malnutrition, illness, and general neglect, and the consensus now is that most were killed or allowed to die as a result of feelings fostered by the patriarchal ultra-conservative religious culture that ran the institution, which largely viewed the infants as worthless creatures that were the product of sin, poverty, and immoral sexual conduct. The children's bodies were disposed of in an unmarked burial ground on the site, said to a cesspit, and of the 800-plus bodies that were dug up, only 2 of the deaths had ever been officially recorded by the institution. The care home ran from 1921 to 1961, and the culture at the time was that unwed mothers, especially teen mothers, were treated as social pariahs and punished by their families and local communities severely, potentially for life, which often meant that the mothers had little option but to go to a place where they could give birth in secret and then have the baby removed. The midwives at these institutions, which were not hospitals, could be very abusive, and denial of things like painkillers during childbirth was often enforced, as the pain of childbirth was seen as part of the punishment for the mother's sinful sexual conduct. The baby would then often be taken away from the mother, whether she begged to keep it or not, where the institution then typically listed the child as abandoned or orphaned on its record system. Officially, these taken children would then be raised by institutions until they were adopted by someone. Meanwhile, the biological mothers would not only be prevented from ever having contact with their child again, but even from knowing a shred of information about their child's eventual fate. After giving birth, it was also common practice at the care home for the teen mother to be sent to work in the Magdalene laundries, which were a notorious workhouse-style system with heavy religious undertones in Ireland that punished girls like them in a moral character, reform through prayer and hard labor attitude type approach. On the outside, the Magdalene laundries were perceived by some to be noble and charitable institutions that offered women from the bottom dregs of society, unwed mothers, mothers who had left abusive husbands, runaway girls, mothers who have had their children taken away due to poverty, etc., a second chance in society to reform themselves and get a job. But most people were aware of the reality of the institution, which was that it was a place where endless girls and women were subjected to terrible working conditions, verbal and physical abuse, and where many were maimed or even killed. Because of the terrible work conditions, some women there also suffered sexual abuse, for which there was obviously no justice, but most people socially tolerated the institution's place in society for the hatred and disdain toward the nature of the girls and women there were so widespread that nobody had any issues knowing that they suffered such abuse and neglect, as it was viewed as further morally justifiable punishment for the females' sins. The people who ran these institutions were extremely well connected with the church and very powerful in their local communities, and they effectively ruled as untouchable gods over the lives of children born out of sin, who, conversely, had no power nor status in their communities. The care homes were often run like prisons, with the children being almost never let outside of the grounds, and due to the secretive nature of the births and record-keeping, often the local communities had no idea that many of the children even individually existed. Nobody listened to the mothers' pleas nor concerns for decades, but even after very serious alarm bells started being rung in the 1970s after the Tuam care home was closed down, for example, when some workers discovered bags of children's bones in the basement, rumors in the communities of mass graves at the site abounded. The problem was the people who ran the former institution were still alive, influential and active members of the church and in their communities, and effectively used their connections and influence to cancel or discourage any formal investigations into the matter. It took years of campaigning by various individuals before any excavation at the site took place. A part of what finally broke the barrier was the discovery of 222 children's remains at a different but similar former care home. But an even bigger part of why a lot of these excavations took so long to take place is simply because the people who once ran these institutions have now largely died off, and with them not only their influence, but also a great deal of the accountability that the broader church has over these institutions of cruelty. And if hundreds of dead children was not bad enough, there are ongoing investigations at the moment that over 1,000 children may have been human trafficked from the care home to God knows what fate, and the scale of this problem, the murder, sexual abuse, and trafficking of children, etc., does appear to be massive, affecting many more former religious-run care homes and similar institutions across not just Catholic Ireland, but the broader UK. Beyond a handful of verbal apologies, there has never been any real justice over this industrialized, terrible slaughter and abuse of these thousands of women, babies, and kids by the Catholic Church. It's pretty terrible, the things that zealots have done in the name of a religion or a belief in a person or something. So be kind to your neighbor, right? Golden rule of almost any religion, yet that's the first one we forget. The first king of Hawaii, Kamehameha the Great, united the islands via conquest, and on Oahu he defeated the main force opposing him by trapping them on a cliff, the Pali, and essentially shoving them off. In the 1960s, when they began building a highway through the mountains, they at one point were doing construction in an area where the battle was fought, and the construction unearthed hundreds of skulls and human remains. To this day, no one camps or hikes in the valley beneath the Pali because of several supernatural incidents many believe are linked to the fact hundreds fell to their death in the valley. Going through the Journal of Conquistadors, there's evidence that Mesoamerica had philosophical schools to equal Western, Eastern traditions, but completely unique. As you might imagine, eradicating all traces of it was one of the church's biggest priorities. Given the book 1491 a read, it includes a heartbreaking transcript of a philosophical theological debate between Aztec and Spanish priests. King Tut's tomb. I saw a picture of the seal that was on the tomb entrance before it was opened, and I don't know why, but it made me feel so sad and disturbed that it was opened. I know it was a great discovery and taught us a lot about ancient Egypt, but it's still sad. I wish a little that their tombs wouldn't be disturbed and would last for thousands of years more without being discovered. So what's your opinion? Do you think it's better to leave the past alone with respect, or to unearth anything we want because, hey, we can? Thoughts? Sure, there's many hidden ones away from public view, but in my opinion, the one for me would be Göbekli Tepe, a very old archaeological site, approximately 10,000 years. It's pretty advanced stone workmanship, almost on par with the pyramids, and the fact that the site was deliberately covered up for some unknown reason. Can't remember how big the site is, but yeah, the site was not covered up by any natural means or over time. Usual drawings of beings with handbags that are practically everywhere. It's not exactly archaeological, but it's somewhat adjacent. In my hometown area in Massachusetts, there's a man-made reservoir called the Quabbin. Several towns were eminent domained and forced to move to create a water supply for Boston. As part of the process, they had to demolish houses and dig up graveyards. More than a few bodies had to be moved into new coffins, and they discovered more than a few people had been mistakenly buried alive. How did they know? They found scratches on the lids of the coffins and lining material under their nails. It's not one particular thing, but essentially in the millennia of brain drain, we've discovered a lot of instances of things that are exceptionally advanced. Successful brain surgeries, buildings with architecture such that they can sound like birds calling back to you, precision mapping techniques, etc., etc. And these are just the big ones that have made news or viral internet fame. And through mankind's assorted upheavals due to war, famine, jealousy, politics, etc., we've managed to erase the knowledge that was poured into these advances. The most recent iteration of this, of course, is European colonization and the ongoing mythos around white supremacy, so much so that we have people who actually try to chalk these incredible advances up to aliens. Right. Because surely, in the 100,000 years of our species, only white Europeans ever made significant strides in technology, medicine, architecture, etc. These same assholes whose doctors protested at washing their hands before operating on patients. We only see a fraction of the past, and there are entire empires and civilizations we can't even begin to learn about because we have mere scraps of what used to exist of them. How far would mankind have gotten, really, if we didn't have to keep warring over resources or destroying one another's civilizations and culture? What kinds of insane butterfly effects have driven rampant ignorance and death because even one potential inventor, doctor, architect's life was snuffed out? The enormity of human potential never achieved looms large in my mind. I fear the reason we don't hear anything out there might be aliens is because the great filter explanation of Fermi's paradox is a constant, that all civilizations are doomed to only dream of their potential before animalistic cruelty, rampant consumption, and war ultimately reduce them to nothing. And there's only so many times civilization can fall before humanity can't rise from the ashes again. The Silurian hypothesis, long and short, is it ponders the question of what if we're not the first industrialized species on this planet? How so? Our species has been industrialized since, let's say, 1800, so only 200 years of meaningful tech and been around for 10,000 years tops as some form of society. Imagine, in 4.5 billion years, how many times could this exact scenario have happened? Even in 100 million years, it's enough time to rise as a species and die, and most everything would be gone. And given enough time, anything left could be even consumed by tectonic plates. The interesting thing is, the most obvious sign of industrialized civilization that we know of, spikes in carbon dioxide, have been discovered most recently to us is 56 million years ago. But there are 6 or 7 total that have been identified throughout history. It's kind of ominous to think an entire source could be born, rise to greatness, and disappear completely without a trace multiple times. We may very well be just the 8th iteration of this happening without even knowing it.